I'd like to welcome everyone to Eastern Suffolk BOCES Community Legislative Committee meeting. It's a hybrid meeting on Zoom, Thursday, March 21st, 2024. And I'd like to start off with the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Oh, I just lost everybody. Hold on. Okay, I'm back on.
Okay.
Just lost. Okay, thank you again. David?
All right, thanks, Bill. Yeah, thank you. Yes, if you're just joining us, rather than have everybody in the chat, in the Zoom room here, introduce themselves in person, just type your name and your relationship to the agency within the chat, just so our guest knows who's here. But our guest is Julie Marlette, director at Hinman Straub, attorneys at law in Albany, New York. I won't take too much of Julie's bio because I believe she's going to share a little bit of her journey with us. But I guess the best way to say it is Julie spent most of her adult life in or around the state legislature, and that means that I know that just does she know her way around that building and those that support it, but she's one of the few people that pretty much any elected official in Albany knows, and also will take her call when she calls, which makes her very good at what she does, which she'll explain. Prior to being with Hinman Straub, Julie worked for government relations for the New York State School Boards Association, doing very similar work on behalf of her clients there. And again, I've been working with Julie, both as a district superintendent and now as chief operating officer for the past 8 years, and have been never ceased to be amazed at the work that she does on behalf of public education and most importantly, the students. She's passionate about her work. She's very good at what she does, and we're happy to have her here with us tonight. So Julie, I gave you a little bit of a background about what the group is and what the purpose of this meeting is, so we won't go into that, but I'll hand the floor over to you and ask you to kind of present to us tonight.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David, and thank you so much for having me, everyone. It's nice to see some familiar names and faces around the room, but I also just wanted to start by saying how intrigued I was, and quite frankly, as a person who does really love what she does, pleased I was as David was sort of describing the nature of this committee, because, unfortunately, I think there's far too few people who are sort of independently interested enough in advocacy and legislative work that they would want to come together on their own time, regularly, just to talk about it and learn more without some sort of specific objective in mind of something they were trying to accomplish. So I was really pleased to be able to come be a part of that conversation and support that work. As David mentioned, I have spent most, and depending on how I guess most of you want to define all of my adult life in or around state government or advocacy in some fashion. This is my 27th session, and I'll disclose to the group I'm 47, so you can do the math on when I started working for the state Senate, and have put in probably about 9 years working for the New York State School Boards Association, 12 or 13 in state government in a variety of jobs, and then the rest doing direct advocacy at the state and very briefly at the federal level. But as is frequently the case with jobs like mine, that's not all necessarily linear, and I moved in and out of agencies more than once over the course of my career. I started out working in the press office for the New York State Senate right at the end of college, and stayed for a brief time after college, and ultimately decided I was more interested in the policy side of the work than reporting on the policy work. And so moved to the Assembly, working first for a member and then for the Speaker as part of the central staff. If any of you are a little less familiar with the structure, the central staff working for the leaders of each house are the staff that actually do the work of negotiating major legislation and the budget on behalf of the majority conferences. So I spent a number of years learning that process and doing that work before going to school boards the first time. I won't give you the play-by-play, but I did go back and forth between there and the Senate, and then spent a few years in New York and Washington working for some national ed nonprofits. It was my time at school boards and then back in the Senate doing their education policy for several years that really sort of solidified my portfolio around working in public education and public education topics. When I returned from DC, I went back to school boards, and it was honestly, I think, through that relationship with school boards that I ended up where I am now. Although David noted I do work for a law firm, I'm actually not an attorney. We have run a small consulting practice within the law firm for non-attorney lobbyists that my boss and president of our firm, Sean Doolin, created expressly to give him the option to bring in both legislative and content area experts who may not have a law degree, but that he felt could best serve the client basis. Healthcare and education are probably our two biggest books of business at the firm. And as such, even when I was not with the firm, I worked with them very regularly through school boards. And that's really where I first developed a strong relationship with David and the rest of the BOCES district superintendents. And when the opportunity to transition from essentially an in-house lobbyist to a contract lobbyist for a broader base of clients presented itself, it really seemed like a very natural evolution of the work I'd been doing my entire career on a slightly broader scale. It's also, frankly, given me the opportunity to at least dabble from time to time in some non-education topics, which after, 15 or 18 years is sometimes a pleasant diversion. I think people talk a lot about advocacy and lobbying and really what the difference might be. And I'll tell you from a legal standpoint, there isn't much of one. Whether we call it advocacy or lobbying, it's all reportable to the same entity. But that I think there can be a lot of misperception about what people like myself really do and how we spend our days. It is not nearly as glamorous as you may think it is. There's not nearly as much glitz to it as perhaps is sometimes represented in the media. It's a lot of hurry up and wait and standing in a corner on marble floors, waiting to catch somebody in the hallway to try and make your point on behalf of a client. But doing the work allows you to really represent, in my case, a lot of public education clients and make sure that their voices are heard to the extent and to the same level as those who have much deeper pockets and the ability to access members through fundraisers and donations in a way that public entities really can't. Something that's, I think, interesting, at least to me, about spending so much of my energy focused in public sector education, really focusing largely on the management teams. I work with New York State school boards, the Association of School Business Officials, the BOCES district superintendents, and then I work with several coalitions of superintendents for regional groups around the state, is that I think a lot of people would probably be surprised how very little of my day is actually spent talking about what you would think of as sort of straight education policy, the nuts and bolts of what goes on in a classroom. I say we've got several teachers and administrators for special education. I promise you that is the way that you want it, because I don't think it would be a very good idea to have the New York State legislature monkeying around in the day-to-day of what you do any more than they already do. But probably spend far more of my time and energy talking about really the operations and functionality of operating school districts and the supports that need to be there to allow the educators to do what they do. And by that operations, I mean everything from the implication of changes in real property tax policy, or I spent a good portion of my day today working on drafting bills to extend procurement laws to make sure that BOCES and school districts can still buy off the state contracts, and making sure that those are in the mix to be passed before the end of the year. Do a lot of labor policy, which directly impacts the day-to-day work of operating a school district. And while it's indirect, it's really still all, though, in the service of the students that you're trying to serve. My time can be spent on, a different thing every hour of every day. I certainly spend a lot of time meeting with legislators, but also probably as much time updating and meeting with my clients. I think that you can only really truly be effective as a representative of a client if they feel like they understand what's going on and what you're doing on their behalf, but also if you can be getting information from the actual experts in the field about what you're advocating for. I write a lot of bills. I write a lot of memos. I do a ton of research. I spend a lot of time reviewing bills that have been introduced to flag what has been introduced without our input to make sure it's not going to be harmful to clients, especially in the education sector. But then might also find myself, pulled into a meeting to help someone else in the firm shuttle people around just to make sure nobody's sort of left stranded in the LOB and not able to find their way to the next meeting. Something that I think is particularly attractive about the firm that I work for is that we operate on a real team-based mentality, which is every client has a team assigned to them, so that if somebody is unavailable, there's always someone to assist. But that, my ultimate goal is that clients' positions are being put in front of the right decision makers at the right time in the process to have maximum impact and actually accomplish what it is they want to see done. And I think a good example of that is, as all of you are probably terribly painfully aware, we are in the midst of, and one would have hoped, coming to the end of the New York State budget cycle. We are not quite 2 weeks away from the end of this state fiscal year, about 10 days, in fact. And theoretically, we are supposed to have a new fiscal plan in place by then. You've probably all heard this from someone other than me already, but there is little, if any, chance that's going to be true this year. And I think that's because of a variety of factors, including the practical, which is the timing of the Easter holidays and Good Friday, but also the just very contentious nature of the budget negotiations, which, as you're aware, include fairly significant cuts to school aid and changes to the school aid formula that have set the stage for what is going to be, I think, a lengthy and contentious debate over the state budget, which, in frankness, is not really a part of the conversation that I believe has started yet. Unfortunately, the three big ticket items, Medicaid, education spending, and housing, are not really areas of the budget where a negotiation has started. And as such, I think that that's going to elongate the process even further than the natural evolution of the Easter holidays would have. As a practical reminder, the entire legislature is up for election this year, so they are very hard pressed to make any compromise on funding of schools going into an election cycle. But at the same time, they need to close down the budget so that they can end session and go home to run for re-election, which puts everyone in a very stressful situation. The way that my work, I think, really plugs into that is I've been both independently meeting with legislators and senior staff on a weekly, if not daily basis since the release of the executive budget. And in addition to that, bringing in clients for a series of constituent-based lobby days, where we bring in groups of different constituencies. The BOCES districts and superintendents, just did an advocacy day on the 28th. The Association of School Business Officials, New York State School Boards, New York State School Superintendents all have dedicated days where they bring members into the Capitol so that there's a concentrated impact of members across the state all hearing from their constituency on the same day with the same agenda. In this case, across all those education organizations, the agenda really being amplifying the negative impact that school aid cuts would have and why it is absolutely critical for student success to see those cuts restored in the final budget. But oh, I'm sorry, did someone say something? Realistically noting that, that's not enough to really keep things moving, and also having to talk about things like increased, the need for increased funding for CTE, the extension of the retiree income waiver, and the impact that the transition to zero emission buses is having, both in the immediate and what we anticipate in the long term on school districts. The legislature certainly has demonstrated that they've heard what we've said, and last week when they released their own independent budget proposals, included many of the things that education and my clients have been looking for, including rejection of the governor's proposed cuts and changes to the foundation aid formula, a due minimum increase for all districts, in one case, an extension of the retiree income waiver, an increase in the capital outlay, an increase in CTE reimbursement, and quite frankly, very significant pots of money attached to things like pre-K reimbursement, community schools, and other, high priority items. Unfortunately, the reality is that legislative budgets are not real bills, and so they are aspirational at best. And realistically, each house of the legislature has proposed spending somewhere between $9 and $14 billion more than the executive proposed in her budget. Without revenue enhancements and significant ones, there's maybe 1.3 to 1.5 billion dollars available above the executive proposal to be spent this year. With all the revenue raisers proposed by the legislature, most of which I do not think the governor will accept, that number could get shipped up to 5 billion. But even if she accepted every tax increase and dipped into the state reserves, there's still a gap of $4 to $9 billion between what they want to spend and what actually is available to be spent, which means the vast majority of what the legislature has proposed and supported is not going to be included in the final budget. And certainly, while I spend a lot of time talking about, thinking about, and focusing on the education budget, we have to recognize that we don't exist in a vacuum. And there's been significant cuts proposed in other areas, including Medicaid, some of which may or may not put us out of compliance with federal requirements if those cuts aren't restored. So we have to assume that some significant portion of funding is going to go into Medicaid restorations, not just education in the first instance. I think I just wanted to pause there and see if anyone had any questions or comments about the budget in general.
Julie, can you provide, whether it's an opinion or what you've gathered over the past couple of months as to why the governor's proposal might have been so drastic, especially after record foundation aid increases when this governor and the legislature committed to fully restoring foundation aid?
So I'm always hesitant to speculate as to anyone's why, because, it's so subjective. What I can tell you is I don't even have to go back as short as a few months to say that certainly I think there has been a quiet drumbeat growing, specifically around Save Harmless, for some time now, coming out of the division of the budget, the finance people for the governor. And the perception being that, in fact, Save Harmless is not part of the actual formula. That is something that the legislature has added on. And that continuing to push money into districts that already are receiving what the formula generates was actually a contributing factor as to why other districts could not be fully funded until last year. Certainly not the only factor, but they have argued that it's a contributing factor. I think a secondary consideration that I've certainly heard talked about is that as the state as a whole continues to lose population, not that many years ago, we were at maybe 200 districts on Save Harmless. We're now at or slightly over 50%, and the anticipation is in years to come that number's only going to grow. And so there's, I think, a hesitation on the part of the governor's staff to commit to a sort of permanent commitment that no matter how much population you lose, we're never going to consider that loss. I will tell you that inversely, what I think a number of people have said is, okay, but that's cherry picking 2 data points out of a very complex formula. And that you can't just choose the ones that help you by reducing the total number because you think there's too much growth going on in school aid. The secondary piece of her proposal, which isn't really a cut, but certainly was a deviation from the formula, was the adjustment proposed to the CPI. What's important, I think, to distinguish between the two is that while the Save Harmless elimination, or I shouldn't even say elimination because that's not technically accurate. Well, she eliminated the language, the way she actually calculated it. And this, I think, is important to reflect on because it shows you how great the scope of this could become in future years. The actual dollar cut to Save Harmless was only 1/3 of the total pot, which means 2/3 of it is still there. But I think we can all agree that for some districts, that is devastating because it wasn't 1/3 per district. It was 1/3 of the total pot distributed differently across districts based on their district wealth factors. But if it's this bad when she's only eliminating 1/3, we can only imagine what those numbers would look like if it ever went further than that. The way the 2 items were handled were very different because the reality is people were signaling in subtle ways that there might be an adjustment to the CPI going back as far as at least October. To the extent that when people started running numbers against the November database, they didn't use an estimated calculation for the full year and only used a 10-month calculation, which kept it slightly suppressed because it was anticipated that DOB might try and suppress the CPI calculation. They gave no indication or warning that they were proposing actual cuts to districts to anyone. And strategically, I think that works in the favor of school districts because I think there's honestly any number of members who are as offended by the way these cuts were proposed as the cuts themselves, because there was simply no way for anyone to prepare for them on the timetable that they were announced. Even if, and in some cases, they wouldn't have been absorbable under any circumstances, but certainly without preparation. By January, districts are so far into their budget process, it's almost too late to unwind it. I do think, though, realistically, while I remain cautiously optimistic that we can at least get back to the formula or close to it in the end, and I think the legislature is incredibly committed to fighting for that, now that this conversation has been started, I do not believe this will be a one-year blip. This is a siren call that this is a change in policy from this administration. And if somehow we forestall it this year, it is coming back next year. And here's where I will fully speculate and just say, in my opinion, even looking at the language she has used in framing the cuts to Save Harmless, is mechanically they remove it and then they restored to the districts on Save Harmless some portion of it using what they called a transition adjustment. When you tell me you're transitioning something, what I hear is you think this is step one in a transition. That makes me very nervous about what step two is intended to be. And so I think on some level in my mind, while I'm engaged on this year's budget, I'm already mentally prepping for next year's, because I think we have to go into next year's preparation for the executive budget, assuming we see something similar and hoping we're wrong.
So another question you just made me think of is, you mentioned the foundation aid formula. You mentioned its complexity, but it was also created quite a long time ago. And when the landscape of the work that we do looked quite a bit different. I know the state education department has requested for at least the past 2 or 3 years funding to work with an organization that would help to research and develop potentially a new foundation aid formula. I believe that request made into both one houses, but I also believe that the governor's staff has been heard in public space saying, essentially, we don't support that because we believe the division of budget has the ability to do that work on their own. What are your thoughts about the possibilities of potentially a foundation aid formula that closer reflects the work that we do, which may recognize some of those subtleties that these districts were losing population, but are also providing more service? Do you think there's any chance of those that $1 million request being met this year?
I do. I do want to offer a perspective that perhaps not everyone will agree with. But I do think it's really important when talking about the formula itself that we always distinguish between the formula and the data inputs that go into the formula. When you think about, at a high level, the formula and its complexities, that's true. But it's also in some ways relatively simple in that it's using a lot of data points to come up with it gives you a cost to educate a student, and then asks, how much need do the students in that district have? How much wealth exists in that district? And then the difference is supposed to be the state share adjusted by region. Where it actually gets more complex is not that kind of, in my mind, somewhat linear calculation, but the things that are out of date are as much the inputs as the actual thing you're putting it into. The cost to educate a successful student is older than the formula itself, because that in itself was a significant study done years before the formula was adopted in 2007. The costs and weights around L students and students with disabilities are based on costs to provide those services, again, in 2004. And that's really, when we talk about the study, it's frankly less about that actual framework you're plugging numbers in, although that's certainly a factor to make sure it's the right framework. But where DOB is certainly probably not qualified is to do that sort of student-based analysis, which is partially financial, but also educational, on what are the average costs to educate special education students and what is the acuity level that we're seeing, which anecdotally, I tell you from talking to a lot of districts, seems as though it's significantly greater than it was even 5 years ago, much less 20. where I think the push-pull has been, it is in part, once it goes to the state education department, the governor's office doesn't control it anymore because they're not an executive agency. So I think that's part of the tension. I've also will say in recent days, the governor's public position has been much more that she doesn't actually believe that anyone thinks there needs to be a study. She thinks it's just, I'm just quoting from Politico. It's just an effort on behalf of the legislature to kick the can down the road and keep inflating spending while that work goes on. I think that there's very potentially room for negotiation on this, but I do question at what cost, like what has to be traded and or given up in the current year to get that for the greater good in the out years, and are people willing to make those compromises?
Hey, Julie.
Yes.
Julie, question about that.
Yes.
So inevitably, if there is a study, there will be winners and losers in terms of funding for districts. Is this legislature's support of a study just kicking the can down the road, but an issue that they're not going to really want to deal with because some of their districts could lose significant amounts of money?
I think there is in my mind, there's a bit of a calculation there. Which is, I think a lot of people are banking on the fact that yes, there are going to be winners and losers. There are going to be more losers if we leave it as is and just lose save harmless. But I'll tell you, looking down the road, I think the days of just every single person gets what they got last year plus, if not over, they're coming to a close. And that updating some inputs to reflect current day costs may very well reduce the number of people that, at least by the formula, end up on the losing end. That being said, politicians are always going to be politicians, and they're going to be fighting to make sure that, it's crafted in such a way that they can, not have that be their districts. And as we've all learned in the last 2 decades, no governor is here forever, whether they want to be or not. And potentially, if we buy a little time, maybe we find ourselves yet again dealing with a different administration, different DOB leadership. The more time we can buy, the better likely outcome can be negotiated. Which I know is not the
What's the thought process with the rural districts upstate, or even for us on our east end, that are losing significant population, but with the tax cap, losing funding with enrollment and other factors is really going to call the viability of these districts in question. And nobody's open to merging, consolidating.
At least in some of the public comments I've seen, I don't really think that's being significantly considered. And there's not been any discussion of the tax cap publicly in the comments on the school aid package. Except for the governor's assertions that all these districts are, in excess of their undesignated fund balance and are in a position to absorb the cuts. Which, I won't bother to dispute, because I think we all know that is largely, though I would be misrepresenting if I said 100% untrue.
Julie, with all the cuts going on, and the Assembly wants to propose the Smart School Bond Act and bring that before the voters for a $2 billion cost. Isn't that suicidal when we can't even get the money for the schools for this upcoming year?
I'm not sure that makes its way into the final budget in the first instance. And since I see there's at least one business official on this call, I'm not going to embarrass myself too much by trying to talk about bonding. Except to say capital money is not interchangeable with operational money. And so it's one of those rare instances where money is not fungible. If people approved that, that would be through the sale of bonds and would not be money that could have been used for this anyways. I frankly haven't really heard from that many districts over the last however many 10 years that thought the first Smart Schools Bond Act was a rousing success. So I don't know how that would impact voters. And that's only if they persuade the governor and the Senate to include this in the final budget, which is a big if, because, and again, you're all out in the field, so maybe you're hearing different things than I am, but I don't know what the sort of natural constituency is pushing for that. Whereas there's any number of other things that the houses propose, that there's going to be somebody in their face pushing them to keep in the final budget every single day. All of that being said, Bill, I add the qualifier. Sometimes one of the leaders decides they have a pet project, and despite a general apathy from everyone, it ends up in a final budget because they're not willing to close without it. We're honestly too far from final negotiations for me to have a sense of that one yet. But at this sort of very early stage, that is not necessarily the vibe that I have about that particular proposal.
Thank you.
That being said, I personally think we're almost a month off from a final budget. So, I mean, in Albany, that's an eternity.
Thank you very much. Do we have any other questions for Julie?
Hey, Julie, anything else you want to present to us tonight?
I don't think so, except to just say, certainly I would advise continue and keep up your local advocacy. If you have an opportunity to engage with local members, I really think reinforcing the direct impacts of the proposed cuts is incredibly important so that they understand it's not just a dollar amount, it's X number of people. I would also say, if I can offer some unsolicited advice that I think really helps. You may not think of it as advocacy, but ultimately it is. Not knowing, really just quickly, because I don't know everyone's district off the top, just by seeing your names, to the extent that anyone, and I know most of you are attached to the BOCES, but I know that some of the board members might be on local boards as well. We're at that point in the process where a lot of people are starting to put out layoff notices. If you're hearing about that in your community, I always strongly encourage people to sort of give their local electeds a heads up. People do not understand the sort of the contractual obligations that districts have around making those notices. And so, I've done a lot of these budgets in good years and bad, and mid-year cuts and all of that. And there's genuinely a real lack of understanding about two really operational things. One, layoff notices, and legislators tend to get very feisty when they feel like they're fighting to restore a cut and then you're putting off layoff notices, and genuinely don't know that it doesn't matter that they're fighting for it. If there's even a chance it's not coming back, you've still got to give notice. It doesn't mean you've laid anyone off, but you have to give notice. The next piece is, this is really the first threat of a significantly late budget with an unknown aid package since before the tax cap. Because the tax cap largely lives in the local government universe and not so much the education universe, the same people aren't always in the same conversation. So the people talking about the aid package may not be the same people having conversations about tax caps. And, yes, we had a relatively late budget last year, but we pretty much knew what the aid package was. Now we have an unknown and likely a late budget. And the disconnect in what people understand, because we haven't had a late budget in so long, a really late budget, is all the things locals have to do for their budgets. Because of course we're in Albany, we negotiate a budget in 6 days in the dead of night and pass it relatively quickly. Not dealing with mailing out absentee ballots and military ballots and public hearings and public notices and that whole dynamic and setting the levy completely changed with the advent of the tax cap. So it's not like when I started my career and we passed budgets in August, but it didn't matter as much because you didn't have to set your levy as part of the vote. And so there's no muscle memory for how school budgets work and why this is important, because it's happening for the first time under this new construct. And I think that's causing just sort of an additional tension and pain point in conversations with legislators that was not entirely anticipated.
So one thing, Julie, someone's echoing here. So one thing Julie did not say about her work is that she's rarely the bearer of good news.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought everyone knew.
So she and her colleagues from the New York State Council of School Superintendents have monthly meetings with the district superintendents in Albany, and they come and they give us detailed information about what they've learned about the budget. And the sad part about their job is the good news, when there is any, doesn't really come out until the end. And so really appreciate you being here, Julie. Really appreciate the depth of knowledge and the technical knowledge you bring to what is a very complicated process. And just really appreciate you being here this evening.
And here's a whole new group of people, most of whom I haven't had a chance to bring down yet.
But she always delivers the news with a smile.
And, I always want to be pragmatic and tell people honestly where I think we're going or that I don't know, but I'd rather give it to you straight and then be wrong than create a lot of false hope and then have people feel like the rug got yanked out from underneath them. But I mean, there used to be a day when if something was in both one-house budgets, it was almost guaranteed to be adopted. But changing dynamics and some court cases that really shifted much more of the budgetary power to the executive really changed that dynamic. And over the years, what it's really done is erode the process where sort of consequence-free to put things in the one house, because it doesn't have to be a balanced budget. So you don't have to identify a revenue source in that case. When it comes down to the final budget, much like the executive budget, that has to be constitutionally in balance. So every dollar you spend has to be attached to a dollar you have.
All right. Any further questions or comments for Julie?
Yeah, Julie, I just want to say how nice it is to see you. We miss you, but as always, you're doing incredible work.
Well, but
much appreciated.
A great job too, and he and I still work very closely together.
Yeah. No, our I think our support structure is secure.
Here.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and it's nice to see you too. You will have to tell Kathy I said hi.
For sure.
No.
So, Julie, as someone we've now said has spent all of your adult life in and around the state legislature and very little of it directly in schools, I hope you understand how much your work has directly impacted public education and most importantly, the students, because things that I've seen you work directly on and seen you get over the hill, if you will, that has been a positive thing for students, you know, and the fact that you've been doing this for 27 different budget sessions, I hope you understand how important that is to us, to BOCES, to public education, and again, most importantly, our students. So, but thank you for being here this evening.
Thank you for having me. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank
Bill,
you.
any closing words?
Yeah. Our next meeting is Thursday, April 18th at 7 p.m. and it's to be determined if it is a hybrid meeting on Zoom.
Thanks for being
With
here,
that,
everybody.
That's, by the way,
I'd
the
like
day
to thank everyone for being here tonight. Thank you.
That's the day I have in the pool for the budget being adopted, just so you know.
Okay, that'll be great.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.